She was born in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building, where the walls were thin and the radiator never worked properly in winter. Her parents were simple people. Her father drove a delivery truck 6 days a week, leaving before sunrise and returning after dark. Her mother worked at a laundromat, folding other people's clothes for minimum wage. They didn't have much, but they had love, and in that cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, that love was enough. No one in her family had ever played an instrument. There was no piano in their home. There were no music lessons, no concert tickets, no fancy recitals on Sunday afternoons. Music, the kind that came from grand stages and concert halls, belonged to a different world. A world they watched sometimes on television, but never imagined being part of. But life has a funny way of choosing people. When she was 5 years old, something happened that would change everything. It was a warm afternoon in late spring, and she was sitting on the fire escape outside her window, watching the pigeons fight over breadcrumbs on the street below. Her mother was inside cooking dinner, and the smell of onions and garlic drifted through the open window. Everything was ordinary. Everything was the same as always, and then she heard it, drifting up from the apartment. 2 floors below came a sound she had never heard before. It was a piano. Someone was playing, and the melody floated through the air like something alive. She stopped moving. She stopped breathing. The music wrapped around her like a warm blanket, and for a moment, the whole world disappeared. There was only the sound. Only those notes, rising and falling, telling a story without words. She didn't know the name of the piece. She didn't know anything about classical music or composers or techniques. She was 5 years old, sitting on a rusty fire escape in a poor neighborhood, and yet something inside her understood. Something deep in her chest recognized that sound the way you recognize the face of someone you've known your whole life. When the music stopped, she burst into tears. Her mother came running, thinking she was hurt. But she wasn't hurt. She was overwhelmed. She couldn't explain it then, and honestly, she still struggles to explain it now. All she knew was that she needed to make that sound. She needed to touch those keys and feel the music come alive under her fingers. It wasn't a want. It was a need, as basic and urgent as hunger or thirst. From that day forward, she became obsessed. She would sit outside that neighbor's door for hours, just listening. The old woman who lived there, a retired piano teacher with silver hair and gentle eyes, noticed the little girl sitting in the hallway day after day. At first, she thought it was strange. Then she thought it was sweet. And eventually, she opened her door and invited her inside. That was the first time she touched a piano. Her small fingers pressed down on the keys, and a note rang out. Just one note. But to her, it was magic. The old woman smiled and showed her a simple scale. Up and down, 8 notes. Nothing complicated. She learned it in minutes. The old woman raised her eyebrows, surprised. Most children took weeks to get comfortable with the basics. This little girl was different. Over the next 2 years, the old woman taught her everything she knew. They met 3 times a week in that small apartment filled with books and photographs and the smell of lavender. She learned to read music. She learned about rhythm and tempo and dynamics. She learned pieces that children her age shouldn't be able to play. And she learned them fast. Too fast. By the time she was 7, the old woman sat her down and said something she would never forget. "I have nothing left to teach you," she said, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "You have a gift that I don't fully understand. You need a real teacher now, someone who can take you further than I ever could." It broke her heart to leave those lessons. The old woman had become like a grandmother to her, and those afternoons at the piano were the happiest hours of her week. But she also knew, even at 7, that the old woman was right. There was something inside her that wanted more. something that needed to grow. Her parents didn't know what to do. Piano lessons cost money they didn't have. Good teachers charged rates that seemed impossible for a family barely making ends meet. But her mother saw the way her daughter looked at the piano. She saw the fire in her eyes, the desperate hunger that couldn't be ignored. So she did what any mother would do. She found a way. They sold the television. They cut back on groceries. Her mother took extra shifts at the laundromat, working until her hands were raw and her back ached. Her father picked up weekend jobs whenever he could. And after 6 months of saving every penny, they had enough for lessons. Her first official teacher was a man named Mr. Bellini, a strict Italian gentleman who had trained at a famous conservatory in Europe decades ago. He had a reputation for being demanding and impatient, especially with beginners. But she wasn't a beginner, not really. When she sat down at his grand piano and played a piece she had taught herself by ear, his expression changed. The impatience melted away. He leaned forward in his chair and watched her with wide eyes. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly and muttered something in Italian under his breath. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. He was impressed. More than impressed. He was shocked. But here's the thing about Mr. Bellini. He was a good teacher for normal students. He knew how to guide someone through the basics, how to build technique step by step, how to prepare students for recitals and exams. What he didn't know was how to handle a child who learned faster than he could teach. She would master in days what should have taken months. She would show up to lessons having already memorized pieces he hadn't assigned. She asked questions he couldn't answer. She played with emotion and depth that seemed impossible for someone her age. And instead of celebrating this, Mr. Bellini grew frustrated. He didn't know what to do with her. She made him feel inadequate, though he would never admit it. After 8 months, he told her parents that she needed a different teacher. Someone more advanced, he said. Someone who specialized in gifted students. It was a polite way of saying he couldn't handle her. This became a pattern. Over the next few years, she went through teacher after teacher. Some lasted months. Some lasted only weeks. They all said the same thing in different ways. She was too advanced. She learned too quickly. They couldn't keep up. It should have felt like a compliment, but it didn't. To her, it felt like rejection. Every time a teacher gave up on her, a small part of her wondered if something was wrong with her. Maybe she was too much. Maybe she didn't fit anywhere. Maybe this gift that everyone talked about was actually a curse that would leave her, alone and out of place forever. She practiced on a second-hand keyboard her parents bought from a garage sale. Half the keys stuck and the sound was nothing like a real piano. But she played it every single day, sometimes for 5 or 6 hours straight. The neighbors complained about the noise. Kids at school thought she was weird for spending all her time on music instead of playing outside. She didn't care. The piano was the only place where she felt like herself. The only place where the world made sense. By the time she turned 13, she had outgrown every teacher in her city. She had won local competitions against students twice her age. She had performed at community events and small recitals. Amazing audiences who couldn't believe that someone so young could play with such power and grace. But she was still just a poor girl from a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper. The world of professional music, of conservatories and concert halls and famous stages, still felt like a distant dream. She had no idea that everything was about to change. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. She remembers it perfectly because her mother was standing at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables when she walked in from school. The envelope was sitting on the table, thick and cream-colored, with an official seal pressed into the corner. Her mother's hands were shaking as she pointed to it. "It came today," her mother said quietly. I didn't want to open it without you." She picked up the envelope and felt her heart pounding against her ribs. For the past year, she had been preparing for this moment, practicing until her fingers ached, recording audition tapes on a borrowed video camera, filling out applications that asked questions about things she had never experienced, music camps she couldn't afford, private masterclasses with famous teachers, performance tours in Europe. Her application had more blank spaces than filled ones. She had applied to the National Conservatory of Music, one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. It was a place where the children of wealthy families trained alongside future concert pianists. A place where talent was expected, but connections and money often mattered more. She had no connections. She had no money. All she had was her music dot. She tore open the envelope with trembling hands and read the first line. "Dear applicant, we are pleased to inform you." She didn't need to read the rest. She screamed so loud that the neighbors knocked on the wall. Her mother burst into tears and wrapped her arms around her, squeezing tight. Her father came home that night to find them still sitting at the kitchen table, reading the letter over and over again, unable to believe it was real. She had been accepted. Full scholarship. Room and board included. Everything paid for. For the first time in her life, a door had opened to that other world. The world of grand pianos and velvet curtains and audiences in formal clothes. The world she had watched on television as a child, never imagining she could be part of it. But here's something nobody tells you about dreams coming true. Sometimes the dream is harder than you expected. Sometimes the place you fought so hard to reach doesn't want you there. She arrived at the conservatory on a hot day in late August, carrying 2 suitcases that held everything she owned. The campus was beautiful in a way that made her feel small. Old stone buildings covered in ivy, perfectly trimmed lawns, students walking around with instrument cases that probably cost more than her family's car. Everyone seemed to know each other already. They hugged and laughed and talked about their summers in places she had only seen in magazines. She stood in the entrance hall, looking up at portraits of famous alumni on the walls, and felt completely alone. Her roommate was a girl from a wealthy family on the coast. She arrived with her parents, who helped her unload boxes of designer clothes and expensive equipment. A professional keyboard, high-end headphones, stacks of music books that looked brand new. The girl was polite but distant. She glanced at the second-hand suitcases in the corner and didn't ask any questions. She didn't need to. The differences between them were obvious without words. The first few weeks were overwhelming. The classes were intense, the expectations impossibly high. But that wasn't what made it hard. She could handle the work. She could handle the pressure. What she couldn't handle was the feeling that she didn't belong. It started with small things. The way conversations stopped when she walked into a room. The way other students looked at her clothes, her shoes, her bag. The whispers she pretended not to hear. She caught fragments sometimes. Words like scholarship kid and where did she even come from floated through the hallways when people thought she wasn't listening. But she was always listening. The other students came from different worlds. They had spent their childhoods at elite music camps and private schools. They had trained with famous teachers whose names she had only read about in books. They spoke casually about concerts they had attended, musicians they had met, trips to Vienna and Paris to see legendary orchestras perform. She had nothing to add to those conversations. Her childhood was fire escapes and community center pianos and a broken keyboard with sticky keys. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was here for the music, not for friends. But loneliness has a way of creeping in no matter how hard you try to keep it out. The professors were another challenge. Most of them were accomplished musicians who had spent their careers in the classical music world. They had certain expectations about how a student should look, act, and speak. They valued tradition and pedigree. A student's background mattered almost as much as their talent. Her main piano instructor was a woman named Dr. Voronova, a Russian-born pianist who had performed on stages around the world before turning to teaching. She was brilliant and demanding, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. From the first lesson, she made her doubts clear. "Your technique is raw," she said, watching her play a piece she had prepared for weeks. "You have natural ability, yes, but natural ability only takes you so far. You have gaps in your foundation, holes in your training. This is what happens when students learn outside the traditional path." The words stung, but she said nothing. She just nodded and kept playing. Dr. Voronova wasn't cruel exactly. She was honest in a way that felt brutal. She pointed out every flaw, every weakness, every tiny mistake. She rarely gave compliments. When other students played well, she would nod and offer brief praise. When she played well, Dr. Voronova would simply move on to the next critique. She began to wonder if she would ever be good enough. Not good enough to play the piano. She knew she could do that. But good enough for this world. Good enough to be seen as a real musician and not just a charity case who got lucky with a scholarship. The other students didn't help. There was a group of them, children of donors and legacy families, who seemed to run the social scene at the conservatory. They decided who was invited to parties, who was included in study groups, who mattered. She was never invited anywhere. She ate alone in the dining hall most nights, pretending to read while the laughter of other tables echoed around her. One night, she overheard two students talking outside her practice room. They didn't know she was inside. "Have you heard her play?" One of them said. "I mean, she's good, but she's so rough around the edges. You can tell she didn't have proper training." "I heard she learned on some broken keyboard in her apartment." The other one laughed. "Can you imagine? No wonder her dynamics are all over the place. I don't know why they even gave her a scholarship. There were so many other applicants who actually deserve to be here." She sat frozen at the piano, her hands in her lap, tears burning in her eyes. She didn't make a sound. She waited until their footsteps faded down the hallway, and then she cried silently in that empty room for nearly an hour. That night, she called her mother for the first time since arriving. She didn't tell her everything. She didn't want her to worry. But her mother could hear something in her voice. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" her mother asked. "I'm fine," she lied. "It's just a lot of work." "Remember why you're there," her mother said softly. "Remember what you love. Don't let anyone take that away from you." She hung up the phone and sat on her bed, staring at the wall. Her mother was right. She was here for the music. She had earned her place, even if nobody else believed it. The scholarship wasn't charity. She had won it with her talent, with years of sacrifice, with countless hours of practice on that broken keyboard. The next morning, she woke up before sunrise and went to the practice room. She played for 4 hours straight before her first class. And she made herself a promise. She would work harder than anyone else. She would practice longer, study more, push herself further. She would close every gap in her technique. She would silence every whisper with the only thing she had taught, her music. If they wanted to see her as an outsider, fine. If they wanted to doubt her, fine. She would prove them all wrong. Not with words, not with arguments. She would prove them wrong at the piano, where the only thing that mattered was what came out of her fingers. She didn't know it yet, but her chance to prove herself was coming sooner than she expected. And it would come in the form of a challenge that was designed to break her. 2 years passed. 2 years of early mornings and late nights. 2 years of practice rooms and sore fingers and endless scales. 2 years of being overlooked, underestimated, and treated like she didn't quite belong. But she was still there, still standing, still playing, she had kept her promise to herself. She worked harder than anyone else at the conservatory. While other students went to parties on weekends, she practiced. While they slept in on Sunday mornings, she was already at the piano by 6. She filled every gap in her technique that Dr. Voronova pointed out. She studied music theory until her eyes burned. She listened to recordings of the great pianists for hours, analyzing every phrase, every breath, every tiny detail that made them special. And slowly, things began to change. Her playing improved in ways that even her critics couldn't ignore. In her second year, she won an internal competition that was usually dominated by senior students. The judges had no choice but to give her first place. Her performance was simply too good to deny. Some students congratulated her afterward. Most didn't, but she didn't care about their approval anymore. She cared about the music. Dr. Voronova still pushed her hard, still pointed out flaws that others might have overlooked. But something in her tone had shifted. There was less doubt now. Sometimes, when she finished a piece, she would catch Dr. Voronova nodding slightly, almost to herself. It wasn't praise exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And from Dr. Voronova, that meant something. By the middle of her third year, she made a decision. The conservatory held an annual showcase every spring, a prestigious concert where selected students performed for an audience of faculty, donors, and important people from the music world. It was the biggest event of the year. Being chosen to perform was an honor that could launch a career. Scouts and agents attended. Scholarships and opportunities were offered based on those performances. Traditionally, the showcase was reserved for senior students from well-connected families, the kind of students whose parents had donated buildings or whose grandparents had their names on practice rooms. Third-year students almost never performed. And scholarship students? That was unheard of, but she decided to apply anyway. She filled out the application form and submitted it to the faculty board. She listed her achievements, her competition wins, her repertoire. She knew it was a long shot. She knew the odds were stacked against her. But she also knew that if she didn't try, she would regret it forever. The response came 2 weeks later. She was called into a meeting with the faculty board, a group of 6 professors who made all the important decisions at the conservatory. Dr. Voronova was among them. They sat behind a long wooden table in a room with tall windows and portraits of famous composers on the walls. She stood before them, trying to keep her hands from shaking. The head of the board, an older man with gray hair and glasses, spoke first. "We've reviewed your application," he said, his voice flat and formal. "Your request to perform at the spring showcase is unusual. Third-year students are rarely considered, and scholarship students have never been included." She nodded, saying nothing. Her heart was pounding so loud she was sure they could hear it. "However," he continued, "your recent performances have been noted. Some members of the board believe you have potential." She felt a flicker of hope in her chest. "We have decided to grant your request." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She wanted to smile, to thank them, to run out of the room and call her mother with the news. But something in the man's tone made her hesitate. There was more coming. There was more coming. She could feel it. "There is one condition," he said. "The piece you perform will be selected by us." That was unusual. Normally, students chose their own repertoire for the showcase. But she nodded anyway. How hard could it be? She had mastered dozens of difficult pieces. Whatever they chose, she would learn it. The man glanced at Dr. Voronova, who handed him a folder. He opened it and slid a sheet of paper across the table toward her. "You will perform Ravel's Gaspard de l'Ennui," he said. All 3 movements. The room went silent. She stared at the paper in front of her. The title seemed to pulse on the page like a warning. Gaspard de l'Ennui. She knew that piece. Every serious pianist knew that piece. It was legendary. Not for its beauty, though it was beautiful. Not for its emotion, though it was deeply emotional. It was legendary because it was nearly impossible to play. Gaspard de l'Ennui was written by the French composer Maurice Ravel in 1908. It was inspired by dark poetry about water spirits, haunted gibbets, and a demon named Scarbo. The music was haunting and strange and technically brutal. The third movement alone contained passages so difficult that even professional concert pianists struggled with them. Some spent years perfecting it. Many never performed it publicly at all. And they were giving her 8 weeks to learn it. She looked up at the board. Some of them avoided her eyes. Others watched her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Dr. Voronova's face was stone. She understood then. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a test. Or maybe a trap. They expected her to fail. They wanted her to withdraw, to admit she wasn't ready, to go back to her place and wait her turn like a good scholarship student. This was their way of teaching her a lesson about ambition. She thought about saying no. She thought about walking out of that room with her dignity intact, saving herself the humiliation of failing in front of everyone who already doubted her. It would be the smart thing to do. The safe thing. But safe had never gotten her anywhere. She picked up the paper and looked at it one more time. 3 movements. Ondine, Le Gibbet, Scarbo. 23 minutes of the most demanding piano music ever. Written. 8 weeks. I accept, she said. She didn't miss the flash of surprise on some of their faces. They hadn't expected that. They thought she would back down. They thought wrong. The meeting ended shortly after. As she walked out of the room, Dr. Voronova caught up with her in the hallway. "Do you understand what you've agreed to?" she asked, her voice low and serious. "Yes," she replied. "That piece has destroyed pianists with far more experience than you. It's not just technically difficult. It's mentally exhausting, emotionally draining. You will need to give everything you have, and even then, it might not be enough." She met Dr. Voronova's eyes and held her gaze. "Then I'll give more than everything," she said. For a long moment, Dr. Voronova just looked at her. Then something shifted in her expression. It wasn't quite respect. Not yet. But it was something close. "Good luck," she said quietly. And then she walked away. That night, she sat alone in her dorm room with the sheet music spread out on her bed. Page after page of dense black notes. Runs and arpeggios and chords that seemed to twist in impossible directions. The more she looked at it, the more overwhelming it became. She thought about her parents, working long hours so she could have this chance. She thought about the old woman who had first taught her to play, who had seen something special in a 5-year-old girl on a fire escape. She thought about every teacher who had given up on her, every student who had whispered behind her back, every person who had ever told her she didn't belong. And then she thought about what it would feel like to walk onto that stage in 8 weeks and prove them all wrong. She wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and turned to the first page. Ondine, a water spirit. A haunting melody that was supposed to sound like moonlight on water. She placed her hands on the small keyboard in her room and played the first few notes. They sounded thin and weak on the cheap instrument. But she didn't care. This was where it started. 8 weeks. 56 days. 1,344 hours. She was going to need every single one of them. The first week nearly broke her. She started each day at 5 in the morning, before the sun came up, before anyone else was awake. She would walk through the empty hallways of the conservatory to the practice room at the far end of the building. It was a small room with a window that faced a brick wall. Nobody else wanted it. That made it perfect for her. She began with the first movement, Ondine. On paper, it looked almost gentle compared to what came later. But gentle was a lie. The piece required a kind of delicate control that pushed her fingers to their limits. The notes had to shimmer like water, float like mist, disappear into silence without ever feeling forced. And underneath that softness was a technical nightmare. Rapid passages that demanded perfect precision. Chords that stretched her hands until they ached. By the end of the first day, she had learned 2 pages. There were 23 pages total across all 3 movements. By the end of the first week, her fingers were raw. Small blisters had formed on the tips, and the skin on her thumbs had started to crack. She wrapped them in bandages at night and soaked them in warm water. In the morning, she unwrapped them and played anyway. She stopped going to the dining hall. She didn't have time to sit and eat while the clock kept ticking. Instead, she brought food back to her room or to the practice space. Granola bars, apples, sandwiches she barely tasted. She ate at the piano, crumbs falling on the keys, her eyes never leaving the sheet music. Her roommate noticed the change. One night, she came back to find her sitting on the floor, staring at the wall with hollow eyes. "Are you okay?" her roommate asked. She didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure how to explain what was happening inside her head. The music was consuming her. Every waking moment, she heard it playing on a loop in her mind. Even when she slept, she dreamed about the notes. Sometimes they flowed perfectly in her dreams. Other times, they twisted into chaos, mocking her, slipping away just when she thought she had them. "I'm fine," she finally said. "Just tired." Her roommate didn't ask again. The second movement was different. The gibbet, the gallows. It was slow and haunting, built around a single repeating note that tolled like a funeral bell throughout the entire piece. On the surface, it seemed easier than the first movement. Fewer notes, slower tempo. But that was another lie. The gibbet required a different kind of endurance. Emotional endurance. The piece was about death, about a body hanging from a gallows at sunset while a bell rings in the distance. Every note had to carry that weight. Every phrase had to feel like grief, like loss, like the slow fade of light at the end of the day. Playing it correctly meant opening herself up to those dark feelings and holding them for nearly 10 minutes without breaking. The first time she played it all the way through, she sobbed, not because she made mistakes. She did make mistakes, plenty of them. But that wasn't why she cried. She cried because the music reached into some deep place inside her and pulled out pain she didn't even know she was carrying. The loneliness of the past 2 years. The doubt. The exhaustion. It all came flooding out through the notes, and when she finished, she sat at the piano with tears streaming down her face and her whole body shaking. She gave herself 5 minutes. Then she wiped her eyes and started again from the beginning. Week 3. Week 4. Time blurred together. She lost track of what day it was. She stopped answering calls from her mother because she didn't have the energy to pretend everything was fine. She slept 3 or 4 hours a night, sometimes less. Her body ached in ways she had never experienced. Her shoulders were knotted with tension. Her back screamed at her every time. She sat down at the bench, but she kept going. The third movement was the mountain she had been dreading. Scarbo, the demon. It was considered one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano. The composer himself had wanted it to be harder than anything that came before. He had succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. Scarbo was chaos and fury and madness, compressed into 8 minutes of relentless technical assault. The right hand had to fly across the keys at impossible speeds, while the left hand leaped between bass notes and thundering chords. There were passages where both hands moved in opposite directions at the same time, creating textures that seemed designed to confuse the brain. There were repeated notes that had to be played so fast they sounded like a single trembling tone. There were moments of sudden silence followed by explosive bursts of sound. The first time she tried to play through it, she stopped after 2 pages. Her hands simply could not do what the music demanded. She sat at the piano and stared at the keys. For the first time since accepting this challenge, she felt real fear. Not nervousness, not doubt, fear. The cold, heavy kind that settles in your stomach and whispers that you've made a terrible mistake. What if they were right? What if she wasn't ready? What if she walked onto that stage in a few weeks and fell apart in front of everyone? She thought about quitting. She actually thought about it. She imagined going to the faculty board and telling them she couldn't do it. She imagined the looks on their faces, the satisfaction, the confirmation of everything they believed about her. No. She would not give them that. She broke Scarborough into pieces, tiny fragments, sometimes just 4 or 5 notes at a time. She practiced each fragment over and over until her muscles memorized the movements. Then she connected the fragments together, building the piece like a puzzle. It was painfully slow. Some days she only made it through a few measures, but she refused to move on until each section was solid. Her fingers bled, literally bled. The skin split open on her fingertips from hours of pounding the keys. She wrapped them in medical tape and kept playing. When the tape got soaked with blood, she changed it and kept playing. Pain became background noise, something she noticed but no longer reacted to. One night during week 6, something shifted. She was practicing a passage in Scarborough that had been giving her trouble for days. A cascade of notes that tumbled down the keyboard like rocks falling down a cliff. She had played it hundreds of times, maybe thousands, and every time something was slightly off. The timing, the dynamics, the feeling. But this time, it was different. This time, her fingers moved without her thinking. The notes poured out exactly as they should. She didn't just play the passage. She became the passage. The music flowed through her like water through a pipe, natural and unstoppable. She kept going. The next passage came just as easily. And the next. Before she knew it, she had played through an entire page without a single mistake. Then 2 pages. Then 5. When she finally stopped, the practice room was silent. The clock on the wall showed 3 in the morning. She had been playing for 9 hours straight, but she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. 2 days before the showcase, she reserved the main auditorium after hours. The same stage where she would perform. The same grand piano. She needed to know if she could do this for real. Not just in a practice room, but in the space where it actually mattered. She walked onto the empty stage. Her footsteps echoed in the darkness. The seats stretched out before her, hundreds of them, all empty. In 2 days, they would be filled with people waiting to see her fail. She sat at the piano. She closed her eyes, and she played all 3 movements. From memory, 23 minutes without stopping. When the last note faded into silence, she sat perfectly still. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were trembling. But she had done it. Not perfectly. Not yet. But she had done it. She allowed herself one small smile. She was ready. The morning of the showcase, she woke up before her alarm. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the piano keys. She heard the music playing in her head, measure after measure, note after note. Her body was exhausted, but her mind refused to rest. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. In 12 hours, she would walk onto that stage. In 12 hours, she would either prove herself or confirm every doubt anyone had ever had about her. There was no middle ground. Not tonight. Her roommate was still asleep. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of breathing. She got up slowly, careful not to make noise, and walked to the window. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was going to be a beautiful day. She wondered if that was a good sign, or if the universe was just being ironic. She spent the morning alone. She didn't practice. Her teachers had told her not to. At this point, more practice wouldn't help. Either she knew the piece or she didn't. Either her fingers remembered the notes or they didn't. All she could do now was rest and wait, but resting was impossible. So she walked on. She walked through the campus, past the old stone buildings and the perfect lawns. She walked past the practice rooms where she had spent thousands of hours over the past 3 years. She walked past the dining hall where she had eaten alone so many times, pretending not to notice the laughter at other tables. She walked past the bench where she had sat and cried during her first week, wondering if she had made a mistake coming here. She had come so far since then. She was not the same girl who had arrived with 2 suitcases and a heart full of hope. She was stronger now, harder in some ways, but also more certain of who she was and what she could do. Around noon, her phone rang. It was her mother. "I just wanted to hear your voice," her mother said. "Your father and I have been thinking about you all morning." She felt tears prick at her eyes. Her parents couldn't afford to travel to the showcase. They were watching from home, hundreds of miles away, probably more nervous than she was. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm ready." "I know you are," her mother replied. "You've been ready your whole life. Ever since you were that little girl on the fire escape, listening to piano music through an open window. Remember that?" She laughed softly. "I remember. Tonight, you play for her. That little girl who fell in love with the sound of a piano. You play for her, and everything else will take care of itself." She couldn't speak for a moment. Her throat was too tight. Finally, she managed to whisper, "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart. Now go show them who you are." The hours crawled by. She tried to eat something, but could only manage a few bites. She tried to read, but couldn't focus on the words. She took a long shower and let the hot water wash over her, trying to release some of the tension in her shoulders. It didn't really work. At 6 o'clock, she put on the dress she had bought for tonight. It was simple and black, nothing fancy. She couldn't afford fancy, but it fit her well, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw someone who belonged on a stage. Someone who had earned the right to be there. She arrived at the auditorium an hour early. Other performers were already there, warming up in the green room, chatting nervously with friends and family. She found a quiet corner and sat alone. She didn't want to talk to anyone. She just wanted to breathe. The showcase began at 8. There were 6 performers before her. She was last on the program. Whether that was an honor or a setup for maximum humiliation, she couldn't tell. Maybe both. She listened from backstage as the other students played. They were good, really good. Polished and confident and technically brilliant. The audience applauded warmly after each performance. She heard the familiar names being announced, the legacy. Students, the ones who had always been destined for this moment. And then it was her turn. "Our final performer of the evening," the announcer said, performing Ravel's Gaspard de l'Ennui. No other introduction. No mention of her achievements or her background. Just her name and the piece. She took a deep breath and walked out onto the stage. The lights were blinding. She couldn't see the audience clearly, just rows and rows of dark shapes stretching back into the shadows. But she knew they were there. Faculty members, donors, agents and scouts. Students who had whispered about her in hallways. And somewhere in the front row, Dr. Varanova, watching with those sharp, unreadable eyes. She walked to the piano. A grand Steinway, polished until it gleamed under the lights. She had played this exact instrument 2 nights ago in the empty auditorium. But it felt different now. Everything felt different. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly. She placed her hands in her lap. The auditorium fell completely silent. Not a cough. Not a whisper. Nothing. She thought about her mother's words. Play for that little girl on the fire escape. She closed her eyes. She took one more breath. And then she began. The first notes of Ondine floated into the air, soft and shimmering, like moonlight on water. Her fingers moved across the keys with a delicacy that surprised even her. The music poured out, not forced, not mechanical, but alive. She could feel it breathing under her hands. She forgot about the audience. She forgot about the judges. She forgot about everyone who had ever doubted her. There was only the music now. Only the story she was telling through her fingers. Ondine ended, and Le Gibbet began. The funeral bell. The slow, haunting tolling that repeated throughout the entire movement. She let herself sink into the grief of it, the weight of it. She played with her whole heart, holding nothing back. Somewhere in the middle, she felt tears on her cheeks, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The music demanded everything, and she gave it willingly. And then came Scarbo, the demon. Her fingers attacked the keys with a ferocity that shocked the room. The music exploded outward, wild and furious and impossibly fast. Passages that had taken her weeks to master flew by in seconds. Her hands leaped across the keyboard, striking notes with precision and power. The piano sang and roared and whispered and screamed, all within the space of a few measures. She was not thinking anymore. She was not counting beats or remembering fingerings. She was simply playing. The music had taken over, flowing through her like electricity, like fire, like something beyond her control. The final passage came. The most difficult section of the entire piece. A cascade of notes that tumbled down the keyboard in a blur of sound. She had practiced it 1,000 times. She had bled for it. And now, in this moment, her fingers executed it flawlessly. The last chord rang out, powerful and final. And then silence. She sat at the piano, her hands still on the keys, her chest heaving. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, impossibly long. And then the auditorium erupted. People rose to their feet. The applause was deafening. A wave of sound that crashed over her and kept coming. She looked up, blinking against the lights, and saw the entire audience standing. Faculty members, students, even the ones who had never believed in her. They were all on their feet, clapping and cheering. She stood up slowly, her legs shaking, and took a bow. The applause continued. It went on longer than any other performer that night. When she finally walked off stage, Dr. Voronova was waiting for her dot. The older woman stood in the wings, her face unreadable at first. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Dr. Voronova stepped forward and took her hands in her own. "I was wrong about you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I doubted you when I should have believed. Forgive me." She didn't know what to say. After everything, after all. The criticism and the cold remarks and the impossible challenge, those words meant more than she could express. "Thank you," she whispered. Dr. Voronova shook her head. "No, thank you for reminding me why I love this music." That night, she called her parents. They had watched a live stream of the performance, and her mother was still crying when she answered the phone. Her father kept saying how proud he was, over and over, his voice breaking in ways she had never heard before. She had done it. She had taken their impossible challenge and turned it into her greatest triumph. But more than that, she had proven something to herself. She belonged here. She had always belonged here. Not because of money or connections or family name, but because of the music that lived inside her, the gift that had chosen her on a fire escape when she was 5 years old. This was only the beginning.